This is my standing desk. I do want to record a podcast. Either this is the set and the camera is on my fridge, or this here is the set and the camera then would be here or here. Or I move the whole monitor away and put the camera on there. The problem with the perspective from here is that this is currently too short for this. So you could do something standing or like this, or sitting on two chairs in opposition of each other. Now, because this is the normal setup already anyway, and it also would be more neutral, it's probably the better long-term option. So I could get a curtain that goes down all the way, and potentially then even film on my phone with this arm here, which I can extend in front of my desk here. I'm currently in the process of replacing all of the lights here with Philips Hue lights. So I could, for example, just give an accent color here, a bluish, a reddish tint, but also down here. But this setup here also just looks very nice, I think. Apart from this here, which is my armrest for writing. Now, obviously, I need a desk because people usually sit when podcasting. So I had the idea to move this more out. This is already kind of the second work plate where I usually have my keyboard on. Now, currently the construction is all with no screws. So this is no screws, this is no screws, and here also not. This is actually a cajon. But I do have an additional plate here already, and so therefore I can put this out, at least provisionary, a little bit more. And the idea is then to have two chairs, currently only have one, and to then sit in opposition of each other in front of this background here. This then is what it looks like. So one guest here, the other one on opposition of each other. I actually think it looks quite decent. Now, one problem is this here, because it is just a little bit too cabley, you could say. In terms of the microphones, I'm thinking wireless microphone. The big benefit of wireless microphones in comparison to wired microphones, like if you had two microphones like this. This is a dynamic microphone. This is just a cap. And if you have two of these, then you need a recorder. This recorder then goes via the XLR cable. So the XLR cable goes into the recorder, like here, the Zoom H6, and then you need to record it on here, or you can also output the audio again to a camera. So what I'm usually doing if I'm recording with this microphone here, even though I switched to another microphone recently, is, at least in terms of recording video here, what I usually am doing is I'm taking the line out, which is down here, 3.5mm audio jack, and I'm plugging it into, so this is a TRS to TRRS adapter. So here are 3 rings, the other cable only has 2 rings, and I'm then inputting it into my Galaxy S10, which still has an audio jack, and then records the audio in video, not in video, but on the file, basically directly onto the native, with the native camera app, it records it directly onto the file, which means I don't have to edit the videos, and I already have kind of professional audio. But this here, even if it's directional, so these are 2 capsules directional, and I tried previously recording with a friend with these capsules, one basically for every person, and we tried recording in front of this, but nonetheless it was quite a good sound, but it was not the best sound. Because the problem is, if you have 2 people and they are at least in normal speaking distance, let's say this is normal speaking distance. And this is also kind of the reason I figured this desk might make sense, because if we have this here and this is normal speaking distance, it's about 1 to 1.5 meter, I would say. The main problem is that normally humans only speak very close, if they are actually very close in terms of the relationship, let's say a wife and a husband or another couple. But for everybody else who is not that close, 1 or 1.5 meter, even on a podcast, makes sense. So if you have a device in the middle that has to record both kind of speaking sources, then this device is not directed into the direction of where the audio comes from, then it is a problem. And even if you have something like this, the capsules still go out like this, even if you can widen the degree at which records. So this can be either 90 degrees, as you probably are not seeing here. It can be either 90 degrees of recording area or field, you could say, or 120 if you rotate or turn, not rotate the capsules. So the other option then would be 2 of these. If you take a look at that Tim Ferriss podcast, for example, he has usually 2 of these mics. And what he also mentioned in an interview is that he often sends I guessed a very, not the most expensive, but I think reasonably priced and also reasonable in terms of quality, a dynamic microphone, which they then can plug in somehow into probably their PC, and then they record remote. But in person, he, I think, has kind of two of these dynamic mics. Now, in recent years, what has become the de facto podcast standard is this mic. It's from Shure, and it's called the SM7B dynamic vocal microphone. In order to make something like this work, you first of all need to pay 2 times 390 euros, but you then also need a microphone stand. Now, the upside of something like a stand like this and not a microphone arm like this here is that it obviously is way more portable. The downside is, as I kind of observed, this is not really evidence, is that the speaker often bends down to speak closer into the microphone. And if the speaker doesn't speak as close to the microphone, then the sound is not that good. Because in opposition to something like this, which is a directional microphone, which picks up basically similar to a field glass or binocular, it picks up the sound that is actually kind of maybe here. So if the sound is, so basically think of it as the angle from which it records. A dynamic microphone has a very wide angle. So similar to a wide angle lens has a lot or records a lot of the field. So basically it records maybe this and this. But if you then zoom in on the camera, this zooming in is what is the difference between a directional microphone and a usually dynamic microphone, even though the dynamic microphone is kind of just the technology that stands behind this. In general, this is called the directivity of a microphone. So, for example, you can see that there are different lobes from which the microphone picks up the sound. So this in closer proximity that records kind of the sphere is apparently called a isotropic antenna, whereas the other one is called a directional antenna. So there would be the subcardioid, the omnidirectional one, which just records the sphere. We have figure 8, bidirectional, directional, then the subcardioid, the cardioid, unidirectional, supercardioid, and the hypercardioid. So the question I'm asking myself, in addition to having this setup here, so having a setup in studio, you could say, or also in real life, what is the setup I could also take with me when traveling that doesn't cost me that much in terms of volume, but also in terms of weight, but also in terms of how expensive this is and therefore the risk of getting it stolen. So what Lex Friedman, for example, uses is almost the identical setup compared to Andrew Huberman, but the mic stand is slightly different. I searched for these on Amazon. They sell for around 25 to 30 euros, but I could not find either Lex Friedman's or Huberman's. But again, the microphone is the same. It's also this SM7B Shure dynamic microphone by Shure, the company. But this is only if Lex Friedman is on the road. In studio, he uses a microphone arm, and this is the one that is made by audio company Rode. This can also be adapted into a desk mount where you just plug in the mic into a barrel, kind of. But this maximally folds into two, so the distance, the travel length, you could also say, is then this here, so it doesn't fold down into something that's smaller. So my idea was, what if I switched to a Rode Wireless Go 2, or in general to wireless mics instead? The standard that is currently kind of going up in YouTube is these microphones, the DJI mics. They come in this case here, which is a charging case, similar to ones you find with wireless earpods. And then they have these two wireless adapters, and these also have a microphone built in. And this is then the receiver. The receiver can be mounted on top of your camera, or it can also be adapted to the bottom of your phone. So you can also input these two devices, so two channels into the receiver, and then directly record onto a phone. Thomas de Lauer, a health influencer, you could say, uses these and has switched to these, and I looked through all of his videos, and he has switched to these about a year ago, I think, and uses these almost exclusively when he talks solo in these videos, but also if he has guests. And what seems to be the setup is that he has these two microphones, and these can also be turned the other way around. So they seem to have a magnetic clip, and you can just have the small clip on the outside and the microphone actually on the inside of the shirt. The other option that has been used for many years is that you have a lavalier mic, which is just a short cable with a small microphone on top, and this then is under the shirt or here somewhere, and then goes into the actual sender, usually at the belt area or at the waist area. But I think the reason Thomas de Lauer uses this, and also maybe many others, in the YouTube videos, not so much in the podcast scenario, is that it's just very easy to set up. You only have to have one camera, and this one camera records it all. In my case, this one camera would be sitting here, and now the big upside, or one of the big upsides of a setup like this with the wireless mics would be that it would only be like this tiny box, and it would not matter that much if I record here, basically within this real life studio setup here, or I would use it the other way around. I would not have to have any cables that are connected to the camera. Now, of course, there could be the argument to be made that you actually want to have a 3-camera setup. So if I am now the main camera and here is one person, then it would make sense to have kind of a camera that is slightly looking at here and then zoomed in on the person's face. If we take a look at this, then we would have one camera that is kind of pointed like this without the distortion happening because it's a 2D screen. One camera that is like this, and then one wide angle. These are the 3 cameras that are usually used in a podcast setup. Some people or some podcast setups have then these rotating things that are going like this during the video. But I currently only have this one camera. I do have 2 phones, which I also could use to record. The problem is just that the battery doesn't last that long. So here's the idea. I already showed you kind of the setup of the camera. And this is then what it would look like with 2 people sitting in opposition of each other. What I did realize is even if I put with the lens I have on, which is a 10 to 18 millimeter, but it is also only an APS-C sensor since this is the Canon EOS M50. So 22 millimeters would be the field you usually see with the human eye. And then there are sensors that are a little bit bigger than this sensor here, which now means that the numbers on here are meant for comparing the normal range of where a camera actually records from to the human eye, but on a different format that has a bigger sensor. This means that the lens would project basically a slightly bigger image or onto a slightly bigger area, and these smaller sensors only cut out a smaller chunk of this area. Which now means that the 10 millimeters here are actually then 16 millimeters converted by 1.6. Which means now, even if I put my freezer here completely onto the back, and then I have this lens on, that I can only record an angle that is this wide. So for reference, I'm 6 feet tall, so this is fairly tall, but at least compared to the average human height, but still I'm barely fitting into the frame. But this is also an image. The 16:9 cutout would then cut out a little bit less, slightly here and a little bit here. So if I then have 2 wireless mics, the idea is just to have them below here in the shirt. But what has also to be mentioned, if I would have a microphone that actually picks up the sound in the direction of me speaking, compared to just beneath the face somewhere, then this would result probably in better audio. So if you listen to these, you can just listen to this here on YouTube. I will not play it due to copyright, but this just doesn't sound as good as something that is recorded with this standard podcast mic, the Shure SM7B. But nonetheless here, the big benefit of using mics like these is that it removes the connection that is otherwise needed between a studio setup or a setup in general, where the microphone is set up, or you have a camera arm or a microphone arm, in this case, a microphone arm like this, and you have to record in the range of this microphone arm in the studio, and removes this constraint entirely. And this means everything basically can be your set. As long as you can have 2 people in opposition of each other, you can also record the whole thing in a park. And since the distance is not that big, this means that the microphone usually then picks up the person. So you could set this up in a park, and all you would need to have then is one camera. At least if you only want to have a 1-camera setup. What I also took a look at what if I just recorded on my phones and also maybe in vertical as I'm recording now and not in portrait. In terms of this setup here, I think with this one camera, it just doesn't make sense to record portrait. What should I record portrait? Because I cannot fit 2 people in like this here, and it just doesn't make the most of any sense. But this, for reference, is if I'm standing just in front of my freezer and I can already record a bigger area with the built-in wide-angle lens. If I rotate this and I would use my phone, then I could record even more here. And frankly, the video output on my Galaxy S10 looks also better compared to my EOS M50, even though the Galaxy S10 is just a phone. And even though the wide-angle lens on this Galaxy S10 is also not that good. But of course also the desk is now again slightly in, so it would have to be more outward here. And the other big idea that I had in terms of realizing a podcast, it would be to just record everything via a software. Maybe it's Riverside, maybe a different software, and then just have my setup here, the setup I usually use, and I could also angle this towards me. I could also use this as the recording device and then just record myself. So this is the normal setup here, and if I would have a camera up here, it would obviously look slightly different, or like this. Since something like, just call it smart editing is already coming, something like this can already switch in between these 3 different views you have. So it would either be person 1 only, widescreen, if both people are kind of, so if one person is speaking and the other one is kind of reacting and it's interesting, then it would be 2. And if then it switches, the conversation switches to only the other speaker, it will switch to the other speaker. This software would cost between 10 to 20 euros a month to record. So for example, $15 a month would give you full HD recording, whereas in the free version you don't have full HD recordings. Now the big benefit of using something like this compared to screen recording something that is Skype or Teams or something like this is that it records basically locally on both devices and stores also the files, stores them locally and only uploads them afterwards. So this removes the internet connection as a bottleneck of this whole setup here, at least in terms of audio and video quality. This then would be something that could be replicated basically with everybody that has a phone on this planet, or with everybody that has access to a camera and a microphone. Maybe even has a setup like this, but then doesn't have to bring the setup like this here. And I also don't have to have 2 setups, or for 2 people, the microphones and the cameras. Now, in terms of recording the other side, what I took a look at is, can I move this background here more to the back? And the maximum I can move it to the back is where my kitchen begins. So I could move this, and this is also where it is usually sitting during the day. And then this background is here, and on top here it is on this tube, and this tube goes into this box here. What I then could do is either position the camera on the screen here somehow, or even use my normal arm, and I already tested this, and put basically my phone, let's just say I'm using my phone, put it in front of this. The big benefit would be that I would still have kind of the same audio and video quality and format compared to my other videos. So I would not switch to the MP4 files of the Canon, which are a little bit bigger in terms of the file size. But I could then still use my Galaxy phones, which I use to record every video, and then put the one in here. I then could either use the front camera and thereby automatically kind of check the image, which would be nice, but it probably also distracts a little bit. So if the screen here is this big, this is now my normal smartphone screen, then I could have 2 of these chairs. And I also looked onto the internet, and I searched this chair. This seems to be a chair called, I think, Dandolf or something like this, by IKEA. And then I could, just like Thomas de Lauer in his videos, I could have the 2 people, so probably not you, probably me as a host, and then the other person on the other side. In terms of the exposure, the Galaxy seems to have a little bit of a problem, but also the other one had a problem. So this is if I have it slightly underexposed, but this now also looks too underexposed. The problem is mostly that I'm now not on the studio lights anymore. So the studio lights are here above, and they are obviously very bright, and they also lighten people that are standing in front of the desk. This is now what it would look like if I turn on these bulbs here, which have a different color temperature, and this is throwing the auto color temperature of the Galaxy S10 off. So then I would have a setup that looks kind of similar to the one Lex Friedman uses, so, or at least used, because he also had a similar setup with a black background. And then this would be the video, so me here, or maybe slightly more into this direction, and the other person on the other side. The problem is currently this is not very long, and also this is in very close proximity, so it would be better if maybe I moved a little bit away from this, and then I had the other person on the other side. But of course now the camera is not ideally, so yeah, well, I don't know exactly. Now the upside of this setup, and I switched to portrait again, the upside of using this as a background is that it is more replicable at another location, because the only thing you need is white light and a black background. If I have this here as the main setup, my desk as the main setup, then
this might look nice, but it also introduces a lot of other variables. What if somebody doesn't like the desk setup? But what is there to not like about a black background and then people in front of the black background? So this is also maybe something I need to think about, because as I go through time, I often change my opinions about something like, okay, the video format, or something like, how should a video look like? And by reducing basically the different variables up to, okay, let's just make it as simple as possible, I also remove all the different, I remove some part of the decision responsibility that stems from optimizing, or there's responsibility on my side to optimize all of these different variables to their optimum. And by removing these variables, I also take out the responsibility to do this. So what I'm thinking is, what is kind of the easiest way to make a podcast? The easiest way, I think right now, would be to not figure something like this out, to not figure out where I need to position my camera, but to just say, okay, I'm already recording on these phones. I also already have 2 of these. So what I could do is, I could make the remote interview the standard. If I make the remote interview the standard, then the only thing the other person would need is a phone that is similar in quality, in video quality and in audio quality ideally, to the one I am already using to make the video look coherent. If I now have a camera like this, then I might have to upgrade the camera in the future. I might go to a different, I don't know, I might change something about the camera. Of course, the same could be true for the phone, but the thing about the phone is that I always have it in my pocket. So the only additional thing I need to then make a good podcast, if I set the quality to, okay, the phone is the video quality plus an external microphone. So what I'm currently using is the microphone I now plugged in, because I'm talking now in front of the phone, and therefore the audio distance needs to be bridged, because previously I talked with the phone like here and I walked around, so the distance from my mouth to the internal microphones allowed them to pick up my voice better than what they can if I'm standing in front here. So I now am using the Rode VideoMic Go 2 as a directional mic. And the big benefit now of the remote setup is that I can record everywhere, but also the other person can record everywhere. So the otherwise existing constraint that these 2 people have to meet on the sphere that is currently the Earth, and have to meet in place and also in time, is basically removed, and only the time constraint remains, and the other person only has to have internet, a phone, and maybe an additional microphone. As more and more people then work maybe also sometimes or partially remote, the microphone part is maybe also solved. So of course the other person could also feed the video in with a different camera, for example, and have a different audio. But as long as I have a software that connects these 2, then I would be able to record a software. What is also something I think to think about is kind of the base rate. Not really the base rate, but let's just assume these are all the possible people I want to interview. Out of these people, so this is now the biggest thing, and then we have subsets of these filters basically that then result in something that is less. If these are all the possible people I want to interview, maybe over my lifetime, then if I say I only do local podcasts, so the person has to come to the studio, or I go to them. So if the person has to come to the studio, then the person needs to think that I'm relevant enough for basically a 1 or 2 day trip with costs included, and this is therefore moving the cost of the interview from maybe 1 or 2 hours for the interview and maybe preparation before and setting up the video setup and the audio setup on their side to 1 or 2 days, which is an entirely different calculation. So out of all the guests, if I say they come to my house, it's probably a very, let's just make it differently, let's just make it kind of a Venn diagram, and let's just say, okay, it's only this much. Maybe a fifth, maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 1%. So if I remove the constraint, I basically go from a very limited amount of guests to a potentially larger amount of guests. The next question is then, what is probably the thing that limits or acts as a bottleneck for a podcast that is me interviewing other people? So the idea is, it's not about me, I'm just the person who's asking the question, basically. Of course, I might bring some flavor, similar to how Huberman asks different questions compared to Lex Friedman and so on and so forth, because they have different backgrounds. But I think to some extent the idea that an interviewer also is kind of part of the podcast and not just the host who is asking the question, and also more part of the conversation than what otherwise would be suggested by, okay, I ask the question and the other person just answers. this idea that there is maybe a 1-to-1 ratio in terms of speaking time, I think this is not right. Because if I listen to a podcast and I kind of know the host already, I often am buffered by the host speaking too much because I just want to see what the guest has to say and not the other way around. So what I'm trying to say here is going from remote, which is possibly the scenario that covers the most amount of guests, and limiting it to these guests that actually would be able to come to the studio here would probably be a decision that would limit the amount of guests and therefore also act as a bottleneck in terms of what holds the podcast back, because I can only interview like 5%, 1% of all the people that I actually would want to interview, that I would find interesting, that maybe also would make then good podcast interviews or a good episode. And this is why I previously actually kind of decided to, if I make a podcast, then I would only make one that is recorded online and I would have my own setup here, but I would not necessarily have to have just this setup here, because I can obviously also go somewhere else. If I just am on a backpacking trip, I only would need to bring a holder for my phone and or maybe my notebook, which I probably would bring anyway, and one microphone. And then I would be able to kind of hold a normal podcast episode. But if led by me liking to work with cameras and to think about setups like this, I kind of intrigue myself too much into this idea that I have to set up here and then you could record it from here and then I would meet the people in person. I go down this path of limiting whom I record with by actually limiting the location, because also the people have to travel here or to another studio or something like this. Then obviously there probably will not be that many guests that are actually left. Of course, I could also say that I loosen the constraints slightly up by saying, okay, I also come to these people, but this then adds the cost per interview in terms of time and money, or alters it from, okay, I currently do not have any additional costs apart from my working time I could use otherwise. I could make a few bucks as I could work somewhere else, and therefore I am foregoing or by I'm not getting the salary I otherwise could make by investing an hour or two into research or podcast. That's what I'm trying to say. So there's an opportunity cost which is currently on my side. And if I travel somewhere for a weekend, for example, just to interview one guest, then this gives me one episode. Whereas if I recorded episode after episode for a weekend with different guests remotely, then I probably would make more of the podcasts and less of the traveling. And the traveling would then be just a financial, but also a time cost. Of course, I could also combine this with traveling actually, but the question is then to which extent this contributes to the overall plan I'm trying to follow, and which would then include also a podcast. A conclusion. If I record in here, there are two options. The first option is that I use my desk as a setup. Then my desk has to look nice. There can't be a lot of cables hanging around because then everybody can see my desk all the time. The second option is that I have this background here, which also means that me and the guest only see the desk and this. Whereas if I remove this, then the guest kind of sees the camera here and my kitchen and the possible cables I have in the kitchen, which makes the experience of recording the podcast probably not as professional. And because it's completely visible that it's my studio apartment here all the time. Whereas if I have this background here and there is also this here, and we could potentially even look up something still on the screen here, then this would be something that looks probably a little bit more professional. But then the question additionally is, how much sense does it even make to record something locally if remotely is probably in terms of how much episodes I get or how much progress I can make in terms of the podcast, which seems to be probably dictated to some extent by the episodes I am able to record, the quantity of episodes. And then if I say, okay, it's about the quality then, and the episodes locally would be better in terms of the quality, or at least in terms of the video quality, or in terms of the connection I am able to establish with the guest. But what acts or counteracts this slightly is, if I'm able, for example, to record 2 times, 5 times, 10 times as many episodes, if I just record remotely, and therefore iterate faster and therefore learn faster, 5 or 10 times as fast if the learning happens. We just assume the learning happens per episode. Then I'm probably becoming a better host much faster if I record only remotely compared to only locally, because then much of my time is spent setting up the camera here, rotating the camera so slightly that it is completely symmetrical, or the other way around. If we take a look at different podcasts, for example, at Andrew Huberman. Andrew Huberman now usually records episodes with guests in his studio. Now, if he doesn't record with guests, then he records them alone in a different studio. So it's basically, he has a setup that is the solo setup. So his podcast is currently a mixture of solo episodes and guest episodes. Then he also has a guest setup, but then for some guests he also travels somewhere, and this is then the travel setup. But he doesn't do remote interviews. Similarly, Lex Friedman also doesn't do them. He doesn't have a solo setup. He sometimes records solo, but only like every 25th time he just records other videos that are not necessarily podcast episodes. He then also has a normal guest setup, and he also has a travel setup, which is kind of a minimized version in terms of weight and also portability of the guest setup. Thomas DeLauer, on the other hand, for example, also has a solo setup, and then he also has a guest setup, but he kind of has them very similar, where he has just this microphone, this DJI mic, and the guest episodes are just the two people on a chair, and there is no specific setup. And there is also no need for a specific setup because he already has kind of a studio environment, which includes, in his case, a kitchen and so on. In short, these are the options. I could either have completely locally plus a travel setup similar to Huberman Lab or also Lex Friedman. I could also record just remotely, and this probably, in terms of the quality coherence, would be a little bit better compared to remote and then one local, because the locally recorded episodes would be better in terms of the video quality and also would be different in terms of the video quality. One guy on YouTube, or one podcast on YouTube who has this merged, who sometimes does video episodes that are locally recorded either in his studio setup or in his travel setup, is Chris Williamson from Modern Wisdom. And this is Chris Williamson from Modern Wisdom, and here we see his setup, his travel setup, which is kind of not really a travel setup because he actually rents out these locations. He has his editor, I think, does these locations and sets the whole setup, and these often look quite impressive. Here in an episode with Jordan Peterson, we have again the Shure M7B with a windscreen, plus these microphone holders that are kind of switching somewhat vertically instead of switching like this here. Actually, this is horizontally. Here we see another example with Sam Harris, also in a kind of very cinematic location. What he also uses in terms of reading the questions, he uses apparently an iPad. It looks like an iPad, and then he has this small Bluetooth keyboard, and he sometimes looks to the host, and sometimes he looks down. But compare this to Huberman, who on his home set also, not on his home set, also often looks down to the papers he actually has. So these are his notes, and he also has a pen often, which he then uses to write to look at the notes, but to also write them down. So I guess he has some questions on there, but he also frequently writes something down whenever a guest says something that he wants to note. And I think this is a little bit more natural, as it is somewhat clear that he looks down here. And this is also kind of a very old school way, just looking down at a paper. The distinction is clear. Either I'm looking at you or I'm looking at this. Now, I scrubbed through the episode, I couldn't find it. What I'm trying to say here is that if Chris Williamson looks down onto his iPad or whatever this is, then it is kind of similar to a person looking down on their phone in a normal conversation. It is kind of seen as a lack of attention, kind of. Whereas the old school way of looking down at something on like a paper is probably more seen like, okay, this person is noticing that I said something important and even noting this down. I can't describe it properly, I think, but the direction this goes in, I think, is somewhat reasonable, at least in terms of my explanation. So now when it comes to the effects of what I just said on the setup I would use, with the three options being either this setup, or me standing here in front of this setup, filming myself like this and looking onto the screen, or filming myself maybe like this and looking onto the screen, or maybe like this, looking onto the screen, or like this and looking onto the screen, but probably this one wins here. What I could then do here is I could take a look at the camera maybe, but also at the screen, but also there would be a slight deviance. Whereas if I have it like here, then it is kind of distinct, so it is clear that I'm looking somewhere else. But since the angle at which so the smaller the angles are, the less it is visible in theory. But if then the distinction becomes again bigger, similar to Huberman looking at the other person and then looking down at the notes, the distinction at least is clear. Whereas if I am like here and I'm looking down on the notes, it's, I don't know. So angle that is not directly into both eyes, slightly off, has the advantage that that it's not exactly clear where you are looking at. You can look at your notes maybe on this side of the screen, and you can also then look at the person. But then you can take a look at notes and even bring up multiple questions and rehearse them, maybe as the other person is speaking, maybe also not ideal, but probably I will not be able to remember all of the things I said during a given interview. And another big upside to using this setup here is that I don't have to change anything. So my phone is already usually mounted here, and then I would just have the normal conversation on, or the normal podcast interview, not normal, but I would have the podcast interview. This now is the Galaxy S10 mounted in landscape in front of, or slightly to the right of my screen. I would then look to the main screen where I probably have my notes on the left, and maybe on the right the interview guest. The microphone I'm using is a Rode VideoMic Go 2. I'm using portrait mode on the Galaxy S10 in the wide angle format with the front camera, which means I can check my image in the camera itself, not in the camera, but on the screen itself. I'm also using the normal portrait mode and maximum blur, so the background should not be that sharp any longer. And this also means that this is just not that sharp, and therefore nobody notices that much about the background. I now switch to the Zoom H6, which is mounted, as you previously saw, on top of my setup here. This probably also sounds good, but since the other one is now a little bit closer to my mouth, it should sound better. So the Rode VideoMic Go 2 should sound better. Ideally, I would also be able to connect the Rode VideoMic 2 to the Zoom H6, then use the Zoom H6 as interface for also giving out the audio I hear then over the headphones. But currently I have not found a way to make this work. There is also a way to directly monitor the audio on the Rode VideoMic Go 2 if you have it connected via USB-C to a phone, which is, if you have the USB-C port here connected, then the other port that otherwise would be an output port to output the audio acts then as an output port to listen to the audio. Instead of using it in order to output the audio into your camera, for example, you can also then listen to the audio with headphones. Now you can also connect the Zoom H6 via USB-C, which then has the problem that I cannot connect it as a USB interface to my PC any longer, so it would have to run over my Galaxy S10. One problem with recording like this is that if I don't always lock the exposure on here, now the exposure is unlocked and I have a black shirt here, that there is too much black, too much darkness in the picture, and this then pumps up the brightness and pumps it down as more light moves into the picture, or brighter things move into the picture, and again like this, which doesn't look the best. This effect can be improved by either locking the exposure on the phone, which I usually do, but I often sometimes forget with recording a video on my phone, or you, instead of having a black shirt, have a white shirt, which then in combination with my skin complexion and also the dark background gives me basically an ideal exposure. Obviously this might be different for different colors of clothes, for different backgrounds, for different lighting situation, and also for different skin complexions. So this would be the setup. Pretty much use the original exposure, that is auto exposure, and then just lock it in such that if I move my hands, it doesn't change and pump up the brightness or pump it down all the time, which does not look too professional. This is what it looks like if I would look on the left side of my screen. This is what it looks like if I look on the right side of the screen. This is what it looks like if I look directly into the camera. And this is what it looks like if I look down onto my notebook screen. And this is what it looks like if I look onto the screen on my Galaxy S10 where the video is displayed. Which might also be something to avoid, because it's obvious that I'm not looking into the camera. Camera, phone screen. camera, phone screen. One question is, does this whole setup and me obviously look as professional as someone, or that someone then would say, okay, I want to be interviewed by this guy. Charles Darwin, welcome